Naming of parts is, of course, is quite a famous Second World War poet, Henry Reed. Naming of parts was to do with the naming of the pieces of the Enfield rifle, I think. And he was obviously bored to tears by the work that he was having to do and the explanations. So his mind kept wandering to spring and the flowers and the gardens. So I give you Angela Hobsbaum. Oh, but I will just say, Angela, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, I hadn't even
The
started.
poem, if anybody wants to read it, it's on the table at the back.
Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne. So, she's done my intro for me.
Oh.
Because
Oh, sorry.
No. I know that there are some neighbours who don't very much like our residences being called blocks, and so I thought it would be better if we called them apartments, and then it was the naming of parts. And I also should say that although I'm doing I'm the one who's standing up here and doing the talking, it's thanks to my friends Marcia and Jan and Sheila, that partners in crime, that this has been put together. So if I forget things, they'll no doubt add their more than 2 pennyworth. And I should also thank Waveney for twisting my arm. Just about recovered. And although it'll become clear that I know a bit about how some of the blocks here got their names, there's also a whole lot that I don't know, and I am very indebted to Wikipedia and other dubious sources. This is certainly the least researched talk that I've done for some time. And I'm very aware, therefore, that there will be people here who know much more about either history or local history or horticulture or gardening than I do, and I hope there'll be time. Please add to this. In terms of the early history, thanks Sheila, I've taken this from what's on the website, thanks to Jan, the local historian. And Fred here will remember that St Luke's Hospital for Nervous Diseases, as this was, closed in 2010, and in 2011, North London Sustainable Housing Partnership was formed by a group of local residents, is what Jan says on the website. I suspect this was a kind of noisy group of Muswell Hillians who kind of, banded together. To provide a community voice. I think they were quite vociferous. And by that autumn, that North London Sustainable Housing Partnership started discussions with Hanover Housing Association, and as you know, Hanover Housing Association has gone through a number of mutations from Hanover to Anchor Hanover, and now we're run by Anchor. And Hanover, I don't know where it is any longer. So the North London Sustainable Housing Partnership began discussions, but shortly after that, some members of that partnership group were obviously a bit irritated by the slow progress which their talks were having, and decided that they would form Co-Housing Woodside. And in March 2013, Hanover bought this whole site for a meagre 26 million. They planned to build 200 homes, with 70% of them being for over 55s. They actually squeezed on 160 homes, so they nearly made it. And then in 2015, Hanover went into a joint venture with Hill in order to actually stick the bricks in the ground. And co-housing was always, from the beginning, quite a recognised part of the redevelopment. And I joined co-housing, I think, in early 2015. And it was quite and at that time we talked about St Luke's and co-housing. And it wasn't until August that year that the site was rebranded. I guess Savills were on the scene for selling by that time. Was rebranded as Woodside Square. And co-housing was asked to recommend some names for the co-housing blocks. Thanks, Sheila. And co-housing was recognised. I mean, we were in discussion with the architects, with Pollard Thomas Ellis, and later with Farrah Huxley, the landscape designers. And Pollard Thomas Ellis designed 4 blocks of accommodation, which were for the co-housing group. They designed what is now Jarman, Levens, Chatto, and houses 8 to 14 to suit co-housing. And those blocks are set around what we can call a village square. They face each other more closely than other blocks around the main square. So if I wanted, from my second floor flat in Chatto, I could wave to Eileen in Jarman, or I could talk across to Levens and ask what's growing on your balcony. So there was always a notion that co-housing would be a kind of neighbourly community. And it's thanks to co-housing that we are here in this room today. I remember we had long, oh God, you can't believe how long, discussions in co-housing about the common house. Not a common room, a common house, because that's, in co-housing, that's what it's always known as. And when I first came in here, I was a bit disappointed that the kitchen, which we had, because in co-housing we thought we were always going to be preparing meals for at least 30 people, and therefore we'd need large, industrial size stoves and hobs and things, and we've only got domestic. And co-housing asked for an open fire in here. The open fire would have been behind one of the bookcases, and if when you leave you look up at the roof of Chatto, you will see that there is a chimney. That's all that remains of our requests for an open fire. But I think that somehow, I guess, by having a common house, Hanover gave up one of its units for a residence. And so I feel quite pleased that we managed to get the common house and keep it. Sheila, just run through the next couple. You may notice, you may recognise some of the people here. We really did work, although every meeting included, and the next one, included a shared meal. We really did work hard on things like, I don't know, how to share cars, what the insurance would be, how to achieve consensus. I remember that was a long and, you remember? Yeah?
It was a weekend.
It was a whole weekend on that.
We never agreed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, where did you actually meet, Angela?
In Friends Meeting House in Church Crescent. Well, at least in my time. Friends, is that how you remember?
We met there for several years between 2010 and up to 2015.
Right. Okay, so that's where we met, sort of very locally, and it, I don't know, it, yeah. Anyway, we, I think when co-housing was asked to suggest names for the blocks, I think we suggested Jarman and Chatto. I think we may also have suggested Gertrude Jekyll, and we might have suggested Sackville West, but clearly the powers above us decided against those, and we got what we have. Okay, Sheila, I'm going to take us round, starting with Hollyhock. So we were only responsible for our blocks. I've no idea who suggested the names for the other apartments, whether that is down to Hanover or
I thought it was
Haringey. You think it's Haringey? Yeah. Right. Well, somebody in Haringey suggested Hollyhock, and although we haven't quite got as beautiful an array of hollyhocks as that, we're working on it. So Rosemore, I could not find any esteemed gardeners by the name of Rosemore, but there is a Royal Horticultural Society garden down in Devon. And what's interesting about that, okay, so 1931, Lady Anne Berry gets her hands dirty in the gardens, which she says are really dull Victorian gardens. But what's interesting is that in '59, when she met Cherry Ingram, if you've never met Cherry, I mean, if you've never read this book about Cherry Ingram, it is Cherry Ingram who was clearly a completely eccentric Englishman, totally bonkers, but passionate about Japanese cherries. And it is thanks to him that we have as many varieties of Japanese cherries as you can go to see at Kew or down Cranley Gardens in another couple of weeks when they're in full flower. So I can quite imagine how meeting Cherry Ingram kind of fired her up, and so she must have been a great traveller, and she collected plants and planted them in her garden. And in 1988, she gifted her house to the Royal Horticultural Society, and this is the rhododendrons there now. The RHS went in and did a load of earth moving and reconstruction of the gardens, but they look pretty smart now, don't they? Okay, thank you. So, Thomas Mawson, according to Wikipedia, I mean, he's a Victorian landscape gardener, completely, I don't know, I was going to say self-made, that's a bit unfair. I mean, for a guy who left school at 12 and then came down, was apprenticed, worked in the building trade in Lancaster, and then he came down to London and worked in a nursery, and he moved back to Windermere and started Lakeland Nursery in the 1880s. It was a period when the wealthy went around building big piles and enhancing them. So there was a lot of work for landscape gardeners. And he built a whole lot. The pergola, I mean, I'm only showing you the nearest place where you should all go and take a walk. The pergola at the top end of Hampstead Heath was restored, I think, when the GLC took it over in the late 80s, 90. And about now, it will look good because the wisteria and the clematis should be scrambling over it, and you can see from the pergola the lower gardens, which when I last went, which is years ago, were very well maintained. So he, as well as doing things here, he also did, I mean, I think he did the Palace of Peace in the gardens in The Hague. He also designed the London Mosque, which, you know, is kind of out of his comfort zone. But he wrote a book called The Art and Craft of Garden Making, The Foundations of Modern Landscape Design, published in 1901, 2 volumes of it. And I think the fact that he knew Lutyens and Jekyll meant that his garden, the whole issue about landscape gardens kind of took off. Jarman, a kind of contemporary gardener. If you haven't, I'm sure you know about his gardens at Prospect Cottage. I think what's amazing about Jarman is that it must be the most inhospitable kind of site to start gardening. It's exposed, it's windswept, it's got sun, it's got wind, it's got salt, everything about it. But I don't know, it was clearly nurtured so carefully by him, and his use of local plants. So he didn't try and import things which didn't work. He capitalized and exploited what grew naturally, and his descriptions of the gardens are absolutely poetic. Levens. Again, I couldn't find a gardener called Levens, but these amazing ancient topiary is just stunning, isn't it? I think what's so extraordinary about this is that yes, Sheila reminded me that on the early plans of the site, it was called Beaumont.
Yes.
One of the blocks was called, Clark was called Beaumont. And then they kind of
messed it up.
well, so now somebody must have known about Guillaume Beaumont, and there you are in Levens with a hotline to Hampton Court, because it was the same. There's a guy looking in here wondering if he's delivering to us, but I think he probably isn't. Although if he's got a pizza, we'll have it. I don't suppose landfall will let our beech hedges grow 5 foot high and 5 foot wide. And I like the fact that it's the first recorded ha-ha in Britain. I think, you know, that's a useful bit of useless information that you can forget immediately. We'll come on to another contemporary, Beth Chatto. I think what's interesting about Chatto is that if those of us who grew up in the East, I mean, it is notionally drier than in the West, you know. So she wrote about dry, clayey, gravelly soils and how to cope with them. Whereas the gardeners who worked in the Lake District did not have these problems. And here's an example of the gravel garden. Well, I think some of our wildflower beds, if we looked up the Grand Avenue path in June, it could well look like this.
Easily.
Yes.
If not better.
Well, who knows? Thanks. Yeah. And she wrote books about the dry garden, the damp garden, the gravel garden, and the woodland garden, and was a very influential 20th century gardener, you know, as well as doing things for garden displays. I think she influenced a lot of modern gardeners. The only one I can find is Frederick Law Olmsted, but he spells it without an A. So is it just that somebody didn't notice that when they called it Olmsted Close? I've no idea. I don't know. Guesswork. If anybody else can find an Olmsted who spells it the way that it's spelt here, who's a landscape gardener, then good. Let us know. Oh, and this is a picture of Olmsted by John Singer Sargent, just to tie in with current exhibitions. I like the fact that he was committed to egalitarian ideals and believed that everybody should have access to the green spaces around us. So you could argue that our publicly owned private space in front of the heritage blocks, is a kind of recognition and tribute to the kind of ideals that Frederick Law Olmsted held dear, that everybody should have green space accessible to them. And he was also very keen on conservation. So I think Olmsted Close has a good handle with him. Okay, and as you go round Olmsted Close, you get to Marwood Square, and Marwood is another of these, I couldn't find any person called Marwood, but Marwood Hill Gardens is a camellia garden of excellence, and some of our neighbours here are doing a fine job of having camellias here. Sheila's got, I don't know how, 3 camellias, 4, 5? 5 camellias. Go and look over the fence and round the front of, they've got 5. Thanks to Marion, there's a wonderful camellia by the tool shed in the raised bed area, and Kirsten's got camellias on her patio, and I'm sure other people have got camellias. So we're doing all right in keeping Marwood. We're not quite in competition with them, but we're getting there. Is it Sir Arthur Blomfield, 1829 to 1899? No, I think it's his nephew, Reginald Blomfield, who was an absolutely prolific architect, garden designer, involved in the founding of the Art Workers Guild, found the Royal Academy Schools of Architecture, gave him bright ideas, travelled in France and Spain. I mean, the list of things which he did is just amazing. Until, of course, World War I kind of put a stop to the large houses and huge gardens, at least temporarily. However, what World War I did was make an opening for war memorials. This is the one at Highgate School, which I must have cycled past and not stopped to recognise that it was all part of Blomfield's work. And the other thing, which again, nothing to do with gardens, but he did design with his colleague Lambeth Bridge. 1935, I think it was opened, and it's still going strong. What's notable is the fact that the red paint on Lambeth Bridge is some kind of a recognition to the colour of the upholstery in the House of Lords, whereas Westminster Bridge has green paint on it. But Lambeth Bridge, red paint, you know, beautifully finished, and still working. And as those people who live in West London know, the moment you take out one of the river crossings to repair a bridge, it creates huge problems. In 1892, he wrote a book called The Formal Garden in England, which was of its time talking about very formal gardens, and was heavily criticised by another contemporary of his, William Robinson, who advocated wild gardens and woodland gardens and a style of gardening which was clearly not up Blomfield Street. And in a way, I guess we've got both styles of garden here, and we're trying to make them work together. Okay, so after Blomfield, we come to Evelyn, known as being this amazing diarist. He wrote a diary every day from birth to death, and he lived quite a long time. Because he was a royalist, he spent 8 or 9 years on the continent, keeping a low profile and not being put to the sword or anything. When he came back to England, he bought, I guess, a manor house in Deptford called Sayes Court, and began to redesign and transform the gardens there. And Pepys said, his gardens, which are for variety of evergreens and hedge of holly, the finest things that I ever saw in my life, says Samuel Pepys. So whatever his gardens were like, they were clearly spectacular, and many wealthy people visited the gardens. Sadly, nothing currently survives of either Sayes Court or the gardens. He published this little pamphlet called Fumifugium, or The Inconvenience of the Air and Smoke of London Dissipated, in which he advocates the planting of trees to purify that noxious atmosphere of London smog, even in the 17th century. 1664, Silver, A Discourse of Forest Trees and the Propagation of Timber, is not, as you might imagine, just about what a good thing it is to plant trees, but a treatise for landowners. Please plant lots of trees which will mature very quickly, so we can then cut them down and build naval warships with them. If ever there was a precursor to the Forestry Commission, I think it must have been John Evelyn. A Discourse of Salads. I haven't read this, but the first recorded book on salads. I think that must be just brilliant. And clearly he had in his friends, Christopher Wren, Samuel Pepys, Grinling, Gibbons, the kind of people who would popularise his garden design. In 2012, 2014, in Deptford, there was a big local community protest movement because the site of Sayes Court, being on the riverside, has of course been bought by a developer who wants to put up a 20-storey block of flats there, and they have waged, or they were waging, battles to try to, if they couldn't save the site of Sayes Court and the gardens, at least to get a proper archaeological examination and exploration of the gardens. I think the gardens still have, or they had, a mulberry tree planted by repute by Peter the Great. Peter the Great, when he was a young guy, stayed in Sayes Court and apparently trashed the house, as young people do even then. And sadly, I think there's nothing there about Sayes Court Gardens except this kind of rather sad-looking park. However, from Evelyn, you just go round the corner and you get to Clark. And Clark is, I think, our only living gardener, thanks to Sheila, who suggests that the Clark in Clark Mansions is Danahugh Clark, also known as the Black Gardener, who in 2016 presented Chelsea Flower Show, had a couple of TV series called The Instant Gardener, and David Austin Roses saw the opportunity to create a new rose and name it after Donahue, and offered to give £10,000 from the proceeds to an organisation, a not-for-profit organisation called Grow to Know, which was launched after the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. And its founder encourages a more diverse group of gardeners to dig, I guess. And the final slide is Danny planting the Donahue rose in the Grow to Know plot. That's a whistle-top. At that point, we've covered all the new apartments, and the heritage blocks were already here and named and are shown on the, I don't know, the 1900 something Ordnance Survey maps. I think one of the names, I think for Norton Lees, may have changed from that time, but they were all in place, so I don't have to deal with them. And they were nothing to do with gardens or gardeners or anything horticultural. They are as they are.